Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about Dungeons and Dragons 5e, it could be any version of Dungeons and Dragons. We're talking about Dungeon Masters, so when I say Dungeons and Dragons, I'm also including games like Pathfinder, which is just a version of Dungeons and Dragons, and other things like it. Now, the screen that you see with Yoda saying, "Talk too much, you do. Shut up to get gains." That's the concept behind it. And I'm not saying that Dungeon Masters should stop talking. That's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm saying is that the way that you present the information to your players is really important. And so therefore, I want to have a discussion, and this is just my opinion, and you are free to disagree with me as much as you like. So it's my opinion that some Dungeon Masters talk too much during the game session. And there are generally two camps or schools of thought when it comes to Dungeon Masters presenting material. And that's my opinion. I feel there's two camps, and some people might fall in between there, but generally there are two types of Dungeon Master that exist. And I'm going to use people that most people will have come across, Dungeon Masters, who are quite famous to illustrate my point so that you understand what I'm talking about. And the very first way of thinking in terms of presenting material is the Dungeon Master who takes as long as it takes to provide the players with all of the details and information so they are completely immersed as a player with their character into the adventure or story or the Dungeons and Dragons session. And that's how they operate. And I think that this is the traditional way that a lot of people see Dungeon Masters, as people who present a lot of information and then open it up to the players. And a really good example is Matthew Mercer. He is a Dungeon Master who spends a lot of time preparing, and when he talks for quite a long time. He gives a lot of information, and then once he's done that, he generally stops. So I would say he is an example of a Dungeon Master that talks a lot. I'm not going to say that he talks too much, because there are some people who really enjoy the way he Dungeon Masters. So Matthew Mercer, you got to remember, he talks for quite a while, particularly when he's opening up a scene, and then he stops and he leaves it. And I've seen him talk from anywhere from 5 minutes through to 30 minutes, and then he will stop for like an hour while the rest of his group, and this is the Critical Role team, talk. And it makes perfect sense. Now, there's a reason why it makes perfect sense. One, the group that you're seeing that Matthew Mercer is running for are a very different kettle of fish to most groups. They're very unusual. They are at the top of their game. They are well liked. They are popular. They do what they do and they do it well. But they also operate in that way for a few different reasons. One, this is how Matthew likes to Dungeon Master, and they have adapted themselves to that. Not only that, they are all professional voice actors who are used to having to stay quiet and say nothing and still retain focus on what they're doing until somebody else has finished speaking. This is the process of learning to be an actor. Whether it be a voice actor or an actor, that is their process, and they have to know how to do that, and all of them know how to do that very, very well. Now, for an average person, that's probably well beyond our capacity to be able to be silent for so long while somebody essentially gives you a big, huge story. I want to make it clear that Sam, Marisha, Travis, Laura, Liam, and everybody else, when they are sitting at that table, are really, they immerse themselves completely. They generally don't ask questions about information that has already been presented, so they don't usually ask for information that Matthew has already provided them with. So they are listening and focusing, and they can do that for long times. But I would like to also point out that none of them are teenagers. None of them are actually that young. Most of them are in their 30s. So they're mature individuals, some of them in their 40s. And so therefore they have learned to be able to be patient and wait their turn. I've found at my tables that is not something that you're generally going to see. So for those of you who were worrying that I was having a stab at Critical Role and Matthew Mercer, no, it is just an example of how they present it. Now, I think a better example of dungeon mastering for just your average person is when you're dealing with somebody who talks for just a few sentences and pauses, and maybe only talks up to about 2 minutes would be a long time. I know that for me, if I have 4 sentences, I will struggle to get all 4 sentences out before one of my players interrupts me. And then I've got to sort of, backtrack. So I have to be lean with the material that I present. I need to be quick. I need to give broad brush strokes, and I will give them broad information and leave it because I'm trying to encourage my players to ask questions so that I'm not just sitting there spoon feeding them all that information. And this is a product of me, my teaching practice revolved around getting people to ask questions and ask leading questions and lead them to the information they needed. So I'm very much a person who's all about getting people to ask questions to get information rather than by presenting them with absolutely every piece of information, because I found that seems to fall into the camp of being a lecturer. And I used to do that, and I have shifted from, I would say I would be, in the past I was more a Matthew Mercer, and now I'm more a Chris Perkins in terms of how I present my information. One of the things that I find interesting about Chris Perkins is the way that he presents information. He is very economical with his word count and the amount of information he presents to his players, and then he just stops and stays silent, much like Matthew Mercer, but he will answer questions, and his players tend to ask questions because he hasn't provided all of the information that a player might need. And also too, there's no way of knowing how much information the players feel they need to have. So I find that Chris Perkins is the type of dungeon master who talks a lot less. He's a sort of individual generally that is dealing with entertainment, but I think it translates well into your standard adventuring group who are just sitting around a table or in the lounge playing Dungeons and Dragons on their day off or after work or whatever. And honestly, I think that is the best example. Now let's be fair here that both of these dungeon masters dungeon master in a way that is for public consumption. So I wouldn't say that Chris Perkins and the way that he does things is completely like your average dungeon master, but I would say it's pretty close to it. And that's partly due to the fact that he's dealing with a bunch of players who like to talk, will interrupt him. He knows he can't speak for a long time before somebody will come up with a quirky joke or something that sort of throws him off, so he needs to get his information across fairly quickly before things sort of start to develop. Now, that is my personal opinion. You do not need to agree with it, and I totally understand if you don't. I personally focus on a short amount of information being dumped on my players with wide brush strokes. And that is simply a product of time. So why do we actually have these two camps? Why is there two camps in the way we operate as a dungeon master? Well, I think the reason why dungeon masters talk too much and say more than they need to is a product of many different reasons. And one of the most clearly obvious reasons that it takes place, in my opinion, is that dungeon masters are being taught by other dungeon masters who've traditionally done it that way. But they're also being influenced by or being told by other dungeon masters, primarily through entertainment and on the internet, who have a lot of influence. And I'm talking about Hollywood stars. Now, everybody knows that there seems to be a lot of Hollywood directors and actors who play Dungeons and Dragons or DM. We're talking about Vin Diesel and a whole bunch more who are heavily involved in Dungeons and Dragons and play, this game behind closed doors. Sometimes they share that information, but sometimes they don't. Not only that, we're talking about the likes of Matthew Mercer. There's a whole raft of YouTube channels who are much bigger than I am, and I would say they're classified as professional dungeon masters, which I am not. I'm not a professional dungeon master, who operate this way, where they give a lot of information to the players, and then they'll stop and they'll be quiet, much like how Matthew does. So I think the reason why a lot of dungeon masters talk more than they need to is because they're being taught and shown by people who are quite good at their craft and quite influential in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. There's another reason why they do it, and I think honestly it's fear. Dungeon masters trying to get every aspect correct when they're delivering their material. And a good example is the slew of videos that you can go and check out regarding how to fix dungeon masters or GM mistakes and how to avoid them and what the mistakes are that you can make and how to do it correctly and how not to do it. All that sort of stuff is plastered all over the internet. It's there, it's in your face, and it's more prevalent than it's ever been, ever. The other aspect to talking more than you probably need to, and that is one, concern about the players getting confused. Okay, concern that if you don't give the players enough information, they won't understand what you have communicated to them, and you might have to repeat yourself, or there might be a misunderstanding about the situation, what's going on, that sort of thing, which again makes perfect sense. There's always that concern that if you don't provide enough information, they'll get upset, or say you didn't provide information they feel you should have provided, or that you feel you personally should have provided. All those things come into play, and it's ultimately around confusion and avoiding your players getting confused. And that's totally reasonable to understand that people would do that. There's another aspect to making sure that you don't get confused, and that is what happens when you don't, if you don't talk enough, players get distracted. This is one of the aspects, the behaviors that players exhibit, and the arguments that can take place, whether they be between the dungeon master and the players. But there's a lot of people who hear other dungeon masters talking about how players get distracted, or there's a lack of engagement. And so there's a desire not to talk less, but to try to flesh out the world and provide even more information, making the information dump even larger and longer than it was before, because they believe that the disruptive behavior, the lack of engagement in their game, is because they're not doing their job properly, and that they need to provide even more information than they were before. And that's not really the case. It might seem that way, and that's my view anyway. So I wanted to cover all those sort of aspects as to why I think dungeon masters tend to talk too much. Now that we've covered all of that, I want to talk about reasons not to talk a lot. Reasons to change the way that you communicate your information. Now, when I say talk less, you may find that you don't honestly wind up talking less. What you do is you break up the amount you say all at once. So you might still have 3 paragraphs of notes that you need to communicate to your players, but instead of presenting all 3 paragraphs of bullet point notes, you only present 1 paragraph or half a paragraph at a time and pause and allow a space to occur. And the reason for doing that, so you still probably find yourself talking just as much, but just not as long, with no pauses where the players can't interact. And the reason for doing that is really simple, and that is player boredom. Players sitting there waiting to be able to engage in the game and do something. Because not all of us can just sit there and listen attentively while we wait for our opportunity to engage in the story in some way. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to avoid players getting bored. The other aspect is it discourages players asking questions. As I said, I really think it's important that players ask questions. And it will discourage players from asking questions if you provide them with all the information that they need or they feel they need. Hence, leaving it open for the opportunity to ask questions is good. To ask questions about why and how and where and what and who and when. And open broad questions or very specific questions. But you know that their brains are working if they are asking questions. That means they've processed the information that you have presented to them as a dungeon master, they've processed it and they've come up with a response, they've asked you a question, and now you just need to provide the information and answer their question. And that is how you develop engagement and interaction between dungeon master and player. And that's why I think allowing space for that is important. The other aspect to it, I think that often gets lost, and that is the concept of imagination. I feel like you reduce the amount of imagination that players or people have to utilize by giving them everything. Let them develop their own pictures in their head. Let them fill in the blanks. It doesn't necessarily have to be the picture that you had in your head, and it probably never will. Even if you give them every little bit of information, there's bound to be slight differences in how they view what you described and what you think you had in your head. That's always going to be the case. Hence, I want my players to sit there and imagine stuff rather than me try to paint an incomplete picture for them with my words. And that's why I think it's a good idea to talk less. Another aspect to this is the providing too much information all at once for the brain to process, and then you wind up with the situation where players are asking questions, but they're not good questions. They're questions about stuff you've already given them information on because you've provided so much information all at once. And as a result, you wind up having to repeat yourself. Now, nobody likes to repeat themselves. I totally understand that. I don't like repeating myself. So hence we want to avoid doing that. So providing too much information for our players' brains to process. There are some people who can process vast amounts of information and it's not a problem. But by talking less, we're going to reduce problematic players who do things we don't want them to do, or that the other players don't want them to do. We don't want the Leroy Jenkins running through the room and doing stuff because we're sick and tired of listening to the Dungeon Master talk, and as soon as they heard that there was a monster, they say, okay, I attack, and there we go. So there's no room for any kind of exploration or social interaction or communication between NPCs and players. We go straight into combat. It is one of the things that instigators, players who tend to instigate and want to make things happen, They are driven to this as soon as they start getting bored. And therefore you will wind up with all sorts of different behaviours taking place, whether that is checking out your phone, or players checking out their phone, going off to do something else, grabbing snacks, chatting about off-topic comments like, what's the new Star Wars movie coming out or something like that. They're gonna start displaying all of the things that distract and take them away from the game by dumping too much information all at once. What we want to do is we want to provide a situation where our players are engaged, allow more time for the players to ask questions and have their characters perform actions in the adventure. If we do that, we have succeeded. No matter what you do at the table as a dungeon master, if your players are engaged and interested and doing stuff in your game, the chances are they like what you are doing and they are not bored and they will not get distracted and they won't do other things. And you are creating the experience that you were hoping to create at the very get-go. From the very get-go. I know this is how all dungeon masters, all they want generally is to have their players interested in playing their game. And that's it. There is always the option, I have to say, for those of you who have the money and the resources, to just go grab yourself a map and some miniatures and just lay it all out. And then, of course, that sort of paints a pretty good picture of what the situation's like, so that you don't have to explain every single detail because you have a map ready for them or some miniatures laid out, and so you can circumvent all of that extra information you might have had to regurgitate off your notes and feed it through your mouth. Essentially, that's what's happening, right? As I said, this is just my opinion and you do not have to agree with me in the slightest. It is your prerogative, as always. But if you liked this video, please share and like the video with other people who might find it interesting or entertaining in some way. Who knows, they might. If you like this sort of content, I do this sort of content quite often live, not always pre-recorded videos, but I do some pre-recorded videos as well. So please consider subscribing if you haven't subscribed to my channel, hitting the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And essentially, if you want to keep supporting me so I keep doing more videos, you supported me by watching this video, and I have to say thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I have many more videos you can go and check out if you want. Just go through my playlists on my channel and you'll find there's a raft of different topics for players and dungeon masters. Now, I don't do Patreon, but down in the description you'll find affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon where you can buy stuff online. I get a small commission. You pay exactly the same price as you normally would. Just go through the link and buy what you want. You do not have to buy the thing I have linked to. Just go through that link first. Okay, this is your opportunity to get busy with your fingers and start typing. If you're part of the live stream, I will respond to you very shortly. If you're not able to be present for the live stream, that's all right. That's what the comment section's all about. So you can go down there and ask your questions and give your feedback or just say hi, because chances are if you say hi to me, I will say hi to you. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.